Thanks for joining us on our Digital Economy Hub. My name is Laura Johnston, Principal at William Buck Gold Coast. I'd like to talk to you today about a few things to consider when looking at GST and e-commerce. Firstly, I'd like to touch on GST on imports. How does that work? So most people don't really think about when they're buying goods from overseas, how that applies with the GST when the imports hit Australia. So most people think, oh no, I'm paying an overseas company. There'd be no GST because they're in America or China or something like that. But what actually happens is when those goods hit customs to be released into Australia, customs actually levy the GST on those goods for you. And you actually most of the time can't get the goods released from customs without paying the GST, depending on the value. So what customs actually do is work out the market value of the goods, and the GST is levied at that point. What that can do is create weird cash flow consequences because you would pay the supplier for the goods in the foreign currency when you order them, and then when the goods hit the country, you then have to pay for the GST to customs. So it does create those odd cash flow consequences. So that can be really tricky when you're completing your BAS, but that's what you come to experts at William Buck for. So there is actually some alternatives though with the GST consequences on imports and the cash flow. You can actually apply so what they call is a Deferred Gst Scheme. What that means is that you don't have to pay the GST when the goods are released from customs, but it is deferred and picked up in your BAS. So the BAS actually creates a cash neutral position where you pay the GST that you haven't already paid, and then it's offset as a credit. So there's a nil cash position there. That can be quite good if you've got significant purchases coming into the country, because obviously the cash flow consequences of finding that GST money up front and then having to get it refunded when you do your BAS is a bit frustrating. I'll go through in the article and the podcast that I'm doing on the website to go into the detail of those criteria to register, because there's a few criteria to meet to register for that deferred GST scheme. Another one I wanted to touch on, which has been very well publicised, is the GST on low value goods and also on digital supplies coming into Australia. So I'm sure everyone's seen in the news that the ATO and the Australian government is always trying to look at the multinational companies, and when they bring in goods into Australia and also services, digital licenses and subscriptions, things like that, how do they pick up the GST on those goods? Because if they're not charging it, then they're obviously getting an advantage to companies in Australia selling those same products or services where they've had to add 10% to their price for the GST. So as of 1 July 18, low value goods, so anything over $1,000, is now subject to GST when it's coming into Australia to what they call an Australian consumer. And what you may ask is, how does the company work out if the person is an Australian consumer? What you probably don't even think about you're doing when you're buying goods online, when you're doing your online shopping, is they'll ask for your address and your country that you live in. That's how they're targeting where you live and whether GST applies, or whether there's another sales tax from another country that they need to deal with. So the same thing with digital supplies and services. If you're an Australian consumer and you're consuming those goods in Australia, GST would apply. Unless you're a GST registered business, they actually let the company not charge businesses in Australia because it would just be an in and out GST charge. So there should be often when you're buying goods on services online to say whether you're a business customer, and if you quote your ABN, they would not charge you the GST. So it's all very complicated and lots of things to consider in an e-commerce platform. The other one I wanted to touch on is exporting goods. So if you're an Australian business, what does it mean when you're exporting your goods or services overseas? Does GST still apply if the consumer is overseas? So generally speaking, where the goods are consumed outside of Australia, it's GST free. And the same thing with a service. If the person consuming that service is outside of Australia and the service is carried out outside of Australia, it's GST free. The goods, if it's going outside of Australia, just has to leave the country within 60 days of purchase to meet that criteria. So there is some criteria around that, but generally speaking, if it's outside of Australia, then no GST. But as I said, with all of these rules, always good to come and talk to your advisor at William Buck. Just wanted to touch on a few quick points, but please come and talk to us, and thanks for listening.